right. To begin, I would like to read our land acknowledgement, as we always do. And we would like to truthfully acknowledge our site's history and present experiences. And therefore, it is important for us to recognize the beginnings of this place. So we take this moment to acknowledge that the history of our site does not start with Europeans. The town of Ridgefield exists on the ancestral homelands of the Ramapo, Munsee Lenape, and Wishquaisgeck people. They were the original stewards of this land on which Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center stands today, and we thank them for their strength and their resilience in stewarding this land, and we hope to continue their legacy of protecting this site and its history. And so my name is Catherine Prescott. I'm the chief curator here at Keeler Tavern Museum and History Center. I'm here in our lovely tap room. I realize I forget to say that sometimes. And I'm joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, Mary Taltis Otomanelli, a board member at the Hendrick I. Lott House in Brooklyn, New York. And tonight we are excited to discuss the history of restaurants, which was a lot more complex than I had anticipated it being. But it is really interesting, as Mary and I both found out. And so we've got a lot of different things to talk about. And as always, please put your questions, comments in the chat throughout. We do want this to be fairly conversational and casual. So if you've got a question, drop it in the chat. No need to wait until the very end of the talk. So definitely do that. And so I think, as always, the first thing we should do is kind of define what a restaurant is. And
this was the most difficult part, though.
It was. So I did find a good 18th century definition of a restaurant, which is it's a medical term, and it is a restorative substance. And the French would consider it a bouillon, of highly condensed nature, because it was prepared without any addition of liquid. So,
where I thought that was going.
No, so that is actually the origin of the term restaurant. It comes out of the French.
Okay.
And it means something that restores, because the very first eating establishments that were called restaurants were intended for people who were ill or infirm, generally sick, who could not eat regular food. And so they could go to these places and sip at their bouillon. But interestingly, I did find a 15th century recipe for a restaurant, which I don't know that if you were ill, you would want to drink this, because it was a freshly killed capon cooked in an alchemist glass kettle with 60 gold ducats. And the gold may be supplemented with diamonds, rubies, sapphires, jaspers, or any other good and virtuous precious stones the doctor may order.
Should we be doing an episode on medieval cookery?
That might be.
I was not expecting you to say jewels.
I was not expecting to read jewels, and I think that would probably be the last time they end up in food in taproom tastings. But yeah, I thought that
simpler. Yeah, I was gonna say we have a very simpler definition we kind of agreed upon when we're talking about what a restaurant might be, and it doesn't include medieval jewels.
Yeah. So kind of joking aside, restaurants have been kind of hard to define, because we really want to figure out what made them different from, say, a cafe or a coffee house, tea house, or a tavern, right? So here at the Keeler Tavern, we know they served food here, but was it considered a restaurant? And what criteria makes a restaurant a restaurant? And what I came to kind of figure out, based on various academics' uses of the term restaurant, is there has to be individuality, right? So you have individual tables, individual servings, prices per dish as opposed to per head. So there's that. There's also choice, right? You get a choice of dishes. And you also get a choice of eating time, which is not often available at a place like a tavern. There's also service. So there's waiter service, table service. There's also an expectation of privacy. So taverns, especially in colonial America, were definitely places where you were out in public and you were expected to be part of whatever was happening. And then the last criteria was that the preparation of food was generally separated away from the diners. So those are kind of my criteria that I come up with that defines a restaurant to me. So there are some places that these days we call restaurants that might not fit into this, but restaurant certainly has become a more broad term. But I think one of the things is that I found difficult to parse was the fact that some people use restaurant, some of the academics used restaurant to mean eating out, like people just eating away from the home, which is a very, very ancient custom. People would eat out for all sorts of reasons because they're not at home, they're working away from home, they're traveling. They don't have a kitchen. A lot of urban people who lived in urban centers, especially poor and middle class, did not actually have kitchens. So one of the things I found is, I think a number of people might have seen this before, is in ancient Roman culture, you have the what's called the thermopylum or the popium, which is basically like a fast food or cafeteria stall where you could go and just get hot food. And so for some resources I found kind of considered the thermopolium a restaurant, but as you can see in the recreation, it's not really a place you go and sit at a table and eat. You grab food and you go somewhere else. And this was intended for people who lived in the apartment buildings in places like Rome and Pompeii that didn't have kitchens in them. So they needed to go and get hot food somewhere else.
It looks like a college cafeteria where you would go and get like a quick bite and then go to eat the rest of your class. Yeah, I mean, there's that definite conversation of, and I had the same problem when I was doing my readings, is you would see a lot of authors and historians go, it's a restaurant, and then they would call it two or three other different things. There were like ice cream creameries that were considered restaurants that were for women and ladies, and that were kind of women only spaces, dependent on who wanted to come in at that time, or respectable things. Oyster cellars I found were often called restaurants, and that was used interchangeably. And it was kind of like, well, is it a cellar in the basement? Is it a restaurant? It's definitely not like a Waldorf Astoria private dining space that has those things that you mentioned, where you would go and have a private dining room. You would have a set menu. Lunch was served at a certain time, and servings were brought out every couple of minutes, like 10 minutes, or so. They were very specific at one point in time of like, you would have each meal sent to you at every couple of 10 minutes. And it's a very obscure reference, but there's a scene in Gilmore Girls where the grandmother was like, I expect my meal at my dish to be changed out every 7 minutes on the dot. And it very much reminded me of that. And I was just thinking back to all the times I've been at a restaurant when it was busy, and I was like, the food will get to me when it gets to me. And it's definitely that shift of semi-public place that takes hold in that in late 18th, early 19th century, that we start to see the rise of restaurants. And it's interesting to see how interchangeable that concept was, but also if you see it, you go, oh yeah, no, that can be a restaurant. But a lot of the times the descriptions that I were reading reminded me a lot of like a Panera bread or like a Pret, where it was like a quick bite. you'd sit down and then you would leave and nobody was really serving you, but you can go get like an ice cream and a coffee and like a quick bite to eat. And I was like, that's not the same as going to like a Delmonico's, but they all kind of mean the same thing.
Yeah. Well, one of the things kind of I found was in the early restaurants. So one of the things I first tried to find out is what is the earliest restaurant ever? Like that satisfies all of these criteria. And a lot of people, for a long time, there was a myth that the first restaurants came after the French Revolution, when all of the cooks in aristocratic houses needed to find new jobs because their employers got their heads cut off.
Excellent. Yeah.
But I did find out, and more, there are academic papers coming out saying that this is not true, that the first restaurants happened before the French Revolution. But generally, for the most part, historians had agreed that the first modern restaurant that had all these criteria of individuality and a la carte menus and things like that were all from Paris. But I did find in one article, they talked about restaurants in 12th century China. And there was a description for a restaurant. So in Song Dynasty China, there were two capital cities because there was a northern Song Dynasty and a southern. And so these two capital cities, urban centers, and they had these big entertainment districts, and they had what could be considered restaurants. The northern one the northern capital had restaurants serving southern Chinese food, and the southern capital had restaurants serving northern Chinese food. So it's the first kind of regional ethnic restaurant type thing. But the description of the experience there, I think for the most part satisfies all of my criteria. And this is from a Chinese writer's memoir. From the 12th century. And he says, the waiter in the restaurant took orders from customers. Then he went to the kitchen and waited in line to tell the orders. When it was his turn, he would sing the order out loud to people working in the kitchen. When the dishes were ready, the waiter would then take 3 dishes using his left hand and hold about 20 dishes, one over each other, from his right hand to the shoulder. Then he will distribute these dishes in the order that they were placed, and 0 mistakes were allowed.
I want to go to that restaurant. I want to see the feet of that waiter carrying all of those dishes. That's a really good description. I mean I would absolutely classify that as a restaurant.
Yeah, and I think it has another quality of restaurants, which is that performance aspect of it that we talked about. Is there is a little bit of a performance aspect, not only on the part of like the staff, but there's a performance aspect to going to a restaurant as well.
Yeah, you see that a lot in New York City, right? It's like a very who's who of what celebrity ate here, and that's what makes it popular, even if the food is not good and it was like a celebrity sighting, and then you go for the ambiance of the whole situation, and you're like, no, but was the food good? Because I don't want to pay $40 to have an okay pasta dish. If I can not do that, that would be amazing. Wow. Is there a menu by any chance? Because I find a lot of new qualifiers for a restaurant also are starting to like attach the concept of menus to that too.
There doesn't seem to have been a written menu, but what they had like presentation or demonstration dishes. If you go to some restaurants in China, like in the window, they have like the fake dishes to show you what's there. And it's basically like that. So they would like show you all of these things that the kitchen could make. You would choose one, and then they had to go and sing it to the kitchen staff, which I love.
No one sings my orders anymore at the restaurant. Although I do like when you get to like sit near the kitchen and the bar and stuff, like you feel like you're part of it. I don't know. But sometimes you're like, I'm a little too close to this way. Maybe I shouldn't have taken this seat.
Yeah, so that was like the first restaurant that has kind of been identified as like a modern day restaurant.
Cool.
But
Yeah.
other than that 12th century Chinese restaurant, the first real modern restaurants, were in Paris. And they come out of these salle de restaurant where you go to drink your bouillon. And they were popularized around the 1760s. I think the first one is identified as 1765 by a man named Antoine Boulanger. And one of the things is that in the 18th century in France, they were a guild society. So every occupation had its own guild that strictly defined like what you did, and no one else could do that. You had to be part of the guild, right? And so there were all of these separate guilds for different eating establishments. So like, you have the pastry cooks who could only do pastries, and you had the bakers who could only do like bread, and the various meat, you know, people who could provide meat. And so for cooked foods, you had what are called the traiteurs, who are like cook shops or cook caterers, and they served the same role as those Roman kind of fast food joints, if you will. And they provided food for people who were out of the house, right? Who needed food when they were away from home. And but that was like very specific, what a traiteur could make that didn't infringe on all of these other guilds. But then you have the restaurateurs who kind of found this loophole where they could serve bouillon because that was not part of what the traiteur did. But then Boulanger started like adding to his menu of not just strictly these bouillons. And then he had like rice cream or like a chicken with a little bit of sauce. And so the Traiteur Guild took him to court to basically say, no, now he's infringing on our, guild duties or whatever. And
Did it work?
it didn't work. So he was able to do it. The court said that whatever he was making, what did not classify as like traiteur fair. And so he got to like have his restaurant. And then there were other ones that kind of popped up because this is also the Age of Enlightenment. And there is this very popular idea that like you could tell who was knowledgeable or moral because they were sensitive people. And so they had often sensitive people had like weak nerves or weak stomachs and things like that. And one of the descriptions I said, it was like they were supposed to have like weak stomachs and bad digestion because they didn't want to spend energy digesting food when it should go to the brain and they should be thinking more. Yeah, that was my reaction as well. But this was like a very, I guess, popular idea. And so it became fashionable to go to these restaurants and sip your restaurant. And so it kind of started from there and kind of just cycled. And then you have the revolution that comes. And post French Revolution, you do have a lot of cooks out of work who are starting to set up restaurants. You also have the dissolution of the guilds. So
that changes everything then.
that changes
it's a free for all.
Yeah, and basically everything starts to be called a restaurant, even though they're doing all sorts of different things. And some of it is because the term restaurant still was seen as like very sophisticated, whereas a traiteur was lower class, right? So you would be, even if you were serving food as a traiteur did, which is very similar to how a colonial tavern served food, like big table, communal dishes, one meal time, right? Even if you were a traiteur in Paris, you would call yourself a restaurant because it was sophisticated, right? And so everybody began using that term.
Okay. And then at some point in time, that French European plan follows its way across the Atlantic and it gets to us.
Yeah.
Because I can see that type of restaurant, tavern-esque, leftover kind of piece of how do we serve people? When do we serve people? Menu question mark maybe possibly shows up by the 1850s, 1860s. Take hold in the restaurants that start opening up in New York City around as early as the 1830s. I have written down 1820s, 1830s is when it really starts to take a shift. And you see that shift into how we were talking about, like how we would think of a tavern, right? Communal food, large tables, no open spaces, no privacy, just no menu. This is what you were given, free for all kind of a situation. And you see Europeans who are so used to that French plan of eating come to the United States and they're like, huh, this is not going to work for us, because it would normally be the American plan was you would come, you would stay in your hotel or your inn, and you would pay for the food. And that was just like an all inclusive, almost like a resort that we would think of today, of like everything is paid for with this one large lump sum. And then you start seeing that shift of restaurant owners wanting to cater to the Europeans, because to them, the European voice is much more sophisticated. It's much classier. It's what they want to appeal to, sets them apart. And then you start getting places like Delmonico's, which is still open in 1820, 1827, 1825. Giovanni Delmonico comes from Switzerland, opens up a little tiny like confectionery, goes, I think I can do this a little better, goes back to Switzerland, brings back his brother, and then they open up a fancier, very sophisticated French-based restaurant. And they get known for like their mashed potatoes and their steaks and like very hearty French butter-based food. And I don't think the menu has changed all that much since then. I mean, they're noted as like if you Google it, it's like the first restaurant. But again, it's like that you want to have that like notoriety, you want to have that claim. There was a fake menu. I learned this in my research, is that a fake menu was going around that would try to predate them. So it would attach the menu to make sure that they were the oldest, and a bunch of food historians came in and they just kind of like they squashed it and they were like, that's not what it meant. But I have a few, let me see if I can pull them up. We've been doing Zoom for years and I still can't. I'm sorry, hold on. All right, here we go. Share. There are a few different kind of restaurants. So all of these came from the Museum of the City of New York, which has a great reference if anybody ever wants to see what kind of restaurants existed at that time. I pulled a few. So the earliest photos that I can find to kind of replicate the two main big fancy and like these on the screen are the ones that I'm most comfortable attending and going to as a patron. They require less sophistication that I could probably agree to in a public setting. But there was a Greek restaurant on the Bowery in 1904, and then Child's Restaurant as well. There's still, even though the tables are lined up, these are still giving you a semi-private conversation. You're still allowed to get the meal that you wanted and requested. You were allowed to ask for steaks being medium rare or rare. Like there was more choice in the customer and more autonomy of, if I'm paying for this, I'm going to get something better out of it. And then you had, if I may, the fancier ones that were truly private dining experiences. You can see a dinner party at Sherry's Restaurant in 1902, and then a restaurant on Fifth Avenue. The one on the right I know is very light, but you can see palm trees and stuff on the corner. All of them were very light exposed, but they get so fancy. And then reading about Delmonico's is that they bring in, I think I have a menu somewhere. Oh yeah, you can see Rector's Restaurant, which is another fancy one. Oh, wait, hold on. Okay, I don't have a Delmonico's. Sorry. We'll keep it on this one. But Delmonico's brought in concepts that we're so used to today, like white tablecloth and cutlery and menus. And they brought in, I kept seeing the words sophistication and flair in everything that I read about Delmonico's, and how like it helped structure the way that we think about restaurants today in the United States. printed menus, large selection of hot meats, and even private dining rooms, which was very fancy. The other restaurant I will show you is Rector's. So this was on par with the concept of Delmonico's. They were a very big huddle of these kind of very fancy upper middle class restaurants that were you went there to be seen, essentially, right? Like it's a very New York City thing to go to a restaurant to make sure that people see you eating in the right places and that you're wearing the right things and that you've done all the right things and all of that fanfare. So Rector's was open near the theater district near what we think of Times Square today, which was known as Long Acre Square at the time in the early 1900s. You can see, I mean, the photo all the way on the right was probably one of my favorite things. Like, it's so Grecian inspired, so like ancient Greek, ancient Rome. You can see the photographs. Like, imagine going to eat at this place and not feeling the fanciest person that you could possibly be. And it was the same concept. I have a picture of the menu, and it's so extensive. So Rector, Charles Rector opened up a restaurant in Chicago, and he was successful. So he came back to New York City to try his luck. And when he was opening up Rector's, he stole essentially the chef from the Waldorf Astoria, which is still a very fancy place to eat and to stay as a hotel. And he was like, I will give you, I think he tried to pay the chef like $7,000, $10,000, some obnoxious amount. And the chef was like, yeah, okay, I'm not going to say no to the pay raise. So the same French chef went from the Waldorf Astoria, took the whole menu with him essentially, and then plopped it into this menu that you see in front of you. Now, when I think of menus, as I was looking at them when I was doing the research for this, they were very, I don't want to say simple, but they weren't as like elaborate. And when I looked at this, it reminded me of like a Cheesecake Factory where it was just like page after page after page, because a lot of these very fancy restaurants came with like cover pages and back pages. So these are only two of what I was able to find. And these are from the New York City Public Library menu collection. I don't know. But like, I mean, it doesn't look that off from the things that we eat today. You have your oysters, your fish, your game, you have cheese, there's coffee and tea in the corner. The special dishes were, I mean, awesome. Cup of strained chicken okra, petite marmite. So you can definitely see the influence of French cooking, but you can also see the fact that they were catering to an American audience and having those kind of American dishes that we still think of today that you still get. I am always a fan of the ice cream and dessert corner on a menu because I will always order a dessert menu. But yeah, look how much chicken is on that. Like the bottom second page on that bottom left is all chicken. So it's very interesting to see. I like looking at menus. I went down a complete rabbit hole when we were doing this research because it was so interesting to see food habits change, and what the restaurants were serving was so reflective of what people were eating at the time. And you can see, you know, like there's things that I would eat on here, which is always really nice as a vegetarian to have some options, because we don't often get an entire selection of vegetables. But yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, I think one of the things that reminded me of is like a lot of the discussion of these early French restaurants, like one of their kind of one of the key things about it is they did have these printed menus that had like, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of things on them. And one of the things that was pointed out in one of the articles I read was that if you actually look at all of the dishes that are listed, a lot of them are actually very similar. Like a lot of the chicken dishes that would be listed on a menu are basically the same thing, like plus or minus, you know, a couple of ingredients, or they're just cooked in a different way. Like one is, you know, braised and one is boiled or whatever.
Yeah.
But also it was pointed out, like in the early restaurants, like in the 19th century, when printing was a lot more expensive to get, you know, you wouldn't constantly change your menu, and there wasn't like seasonality to the menu, even if there was like technically seasonality to the ingredients you're getting in the kitchen. And one of the ways that restaurant proprietors would get around this thing is because they would have these menus printed in bulk, and they would be very fancy, and they would just list every possible thing that their chef could make. And then what they would do is just mark on the menu what was available, like for that month or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you kind of
Very,
had to wade through all of these. And you can see in some of the travel journals, if you read old travel journals, um, that a lot of these foreigners would go to France, go to Paris, and go to some of the early restaurants and just be so astounded by the menus. And they wouldn't believe that their readers would believe them if they just said what like these, so they would just copy the menus wholesale. And so in the middle of this travel journal, you have like 9, 10, 12 pages of just the menu at a given
see
restaurant.
those. But it's such a culture shock because the concept of a restaurant was so unheard of. And then it really just blows up and it becomes this mainstay. And wherever you're going on vacation of where did you eat? And then you go, okay, like I'm going to a separate place to eat my meal. This feels different. And then you're met with the Cheesecake Factory style, like multi-page, multi-course menu. And it's like, how many different ways can this French chef make chicken? And the answer is about 100. And it's very, I mean, it's a very reminiscent of like a Greek diner. Like, I can't, I know. There's a whole page dedicated to souvlaki. I know. But it's very reminiscent of that, of you open up this concept of a new type of eating and you saturate your patrons to the point. I mean, like the diner down the block that I go to constantly, I am still slowly 5 years later, still trying new things because there's just so much on the menu that I'm always just like, I think maybe I'll try this today. Like the amount of customization that you have and the amount of agency that you have in an establishment had been unheard of at that time. And you can see that with, I'm sure at Timothy's Tavern, at the Keeler Tavern, it was just like, here's your food. That's all we have. Your only choice in anatomy and your agency at that time was the type of liquor that you wanted to eat the communal food with. Like you showed up, it was the seat that was available and you just kind of moved on with your life. So yeah, I think we take that for granted a little bit.
Yeah, actually, that was definitely something, because in Timothy's ledgers, in the bills that we have, the receipts that we have, you can see like people who are staying, they get charged for breakfast, right? Or they get charged for dinner. They're not charged for specific dishes. What you ate at a tavern or any of these kind of proto restaurants, as I call them, it's whatever, Esther Keeler had on hand and was willing to make. And I mean, in terms of choice, you also really didn't have a choice of when to eat. You ate when the food was ready. And if you're late and there's nothing left, then, well, you're going hungry that day. Or you're finding somewhere else. So yeah, so the choice in dining with restaurants was, I think, something that was brand new. And I think part of that was why kind of restaurants really grabbed hold also after the revolution in Paris, is you have this democratization of dining, as you might call it, because the other part of being in a restaurant is like there's this public aspect to it, but it's also private, right? Those individual tables, you're not expected to be part of the community and participating, in discussions as you would be at a communal table or a tavern, right? The whole point of a tavern is it's community. And but whereas at a restaurant, you're there by yourself or with your small group, but you're also in public. You're there to present yourself to people. And one of the things that I think one of the articles I read likened it to was in pre-revolutionary France, they had this tradition called the King's Feast, and he would dine. It's called the Grand Couvert, which basically the king would have a giant feast in public, and people in Paris would go and watch the king and his courtiers eat this big feast.
Okay.
But now, I mean, there's no king anymore. But the people can now go eat en grand couvert, right? You're eating in public, you're dining in public. Um, so you're like both the observer and the observed. Um, which also a lot of the descriptions of early restaurants really mentioned, they highlighted the fact that restaurants often had mirrors on the walls. Like a lot of them.
Wait.
And it was really weird, but I think it seems to be as part of this like observation thing, right? And you can kind of look up and make sure that you are being poised and sophisticated, but also surreptitiously observe everyone else in the restaurant as well. And I
Would
think
say I would recommend.
that comes up also in the United States, in the high-end restaurants that were the first ones to like really,
Mhm.
catch on in places like Delmonico's, because you want to be, if you were part of society, you wanted to be seen going to supper at Delmonico's or Rector's or wherever.
Yeah,
Um,
because it's your social standing.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting to see how restaurants started to make this huge shift and had such a large place in how New York City culture started, because before that, where are your public places, right? Like you were saying, people were going to taverns and people were going to places of worship, and that was your two main places, and a coffee shop. But like when we're talking about women could attend and women were allowed to go more often than not, like a tavern was not a respectable place for a respectable woman. So to have these restaurants and to have ladies restaurants that do open up from it was a really big marketing thing, where people realized that women had spending power, especially in the middle class, because they wanted to go out and they wanted to be seen, and they had this new idea of spending power. And you would get specific women's restaurants that popped up in New York City as well, or you would get specific rooms meant specifically for ladies that could be reserved at certain times of the week, and they would have different menus, or they would have special menus, and they would show up in those books, in the travelers books as well, of if you're a lady coming to New York City. I think I have some. Yeah, I have one. I was able to find one. It took a while. But I was able to find just this one. So if you were in New York City in the 1850s, you can go to Taylor's, you can go to Thompson and Sons, you can go to Mallard's, Goslin's, and William Taylor's. And they're all kind of 365, 359, 619 Broadway. They're all still lower Manhattan. They're still nowhere near where Times Square is. So you can really see that shift um, moving uptown, especially when you get to the Waldorf Astoria, you get to Victor's, and you get to Delmonico's. And then Delmonico's starts moving downtown. Which I think is very reflective of. Ooh, I almost just made a smiley face on Zoom. It's too many buttons. Um, it's very reflective of where the power was, because you had more businessmen going to these restaurants, which is where they started making deals. And it was kind of like, we'll go for a really good meal and we'll cut a deal with our friends and we'll do all of these things over food. And it's no longer over like a cup of wine or a pitcher of beer. It's, we're going to go get a nice fancy meal. We're going to be gentlemen and we're going to do this outside of the office. So it became another realm to do business. And you see that in the rise of oyster sellers in New York City, because that was the original hot dog. Oysters were the thing to have. And you can see that in the oyster houses, because those lined lower Manhattan. Just because oysters were so readily abundant, they were delicious and they were easy to get because there were just so many. And the oyster sellers had them in every kind of fried, pickled, deep fried, caked, clammed way. Um, it was really interesting to see that shift of men doing business, also in the concept of food culture and where that was happening.
Yeah, I think that was another interesting kind of trail I went down, was the gender, restaurants and
Mm-hmm.
gender, right? And how women were not supposed to go to restaurants. This was a male space. And but to accommodate women, because sometimes a lot of the early restaurants were attached to hotels, and in the 19th century, women were also starting to travel more by themselves, unaccompanied. So these hotel restaurants did have to accommodate their
Accommodate
female
them.
guests,
Yeah.
right? And so oftentimes they would have what's called a ladies' ordinary, which would just be a separate dining room. But the thing that is interesting to me is, like, in the early days, it would be a separate dining room, basically the same menu as the regular dining room, the male dining room, as it were. Except the men's dining room menu was in French, but the ladies would be in English. Which, I don't know if that's supposed to say something. But
Don't do it during
also,
Women's History Month.
it wasn't so much that the ladies' dining room was only for ladies, because single men or men accompanying women could also eat in the ladies' ordinary. It was just unaccompanied, it was just women who are not allowed in the regular restaurant dining room. But then it kind of, as the 19th century goes on and there are kind of separate restaurants outside of hotels, that's when you really start to get like this division, and you get special kind of ladies restaurants that are supposed to be more respectable. They often didn't serve alcohol. They were intended for women who are going out shopping, and who are kind of living far away, couldn't go back home for lunch after shopping. And it would be things like luncheonettes and ice cream shops, and pastry shops. And this is when you start to get gendered menus, in a way, where you get things like, it became more kind of common knowledge, with air quotes, that women liked lighter foods, daintier foods, but also sweet things and dairy, like creams and stuff, which I did discover that's an 18th century thing. That's from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He did, in one of his novels, kind of basically said women and children like sweets and dairy. So, thanks, Rousseau.
All right.
But the other thing I was like, all of these high-end restaurants were supposedly excluding women to, quote unquote, protect them from the disreputable women who would be in the dining rooms. But at the same time, they also like needed respectable women to attend dinner with their husbands in groups, because they needed to be seen in like their jewels and finery to give the restaurant its status as well. And so it's like this kind of, you're excluding women, but you need them as well. And it became this thing like Delmonico's would allow women, or groups of women at lunchtime or before a certain hour. And so by the turn of the 20th century, an unaccompanied woman, it was acceptable for you to dine in a high-end restaurant before 7. But you could not dine alone after 7, because then you became disreputable. But there was one quote about what defined a lady, at these restaurants, and it was a lady was a woman who looked and carried herself like a lady. It's like, that is not helpful at all. So it's kind of tough to, and it's a discussion that we're still having today, is like, how do you define a lady? But yeah, there's kind of the whole gendered aspect of it. And I mean, even into the 1960s and 70s, there are restaurants that did not allow women in the dining room. I know there were 2 Connecticut ones that were infamous for it, and there was lawsuits and stuff. But yeah, it was also really interesting to me because one of the things that high-end restaurants, Chelsea says, when did restaurants become dating destinations? I was actually just about to get into this because in Paris,
Timing.
yeah, it was great timing. In Paris restaurants at the end of the 19th century often had what they called cabinet particulier, which were just private rooms or like little booths that could be curtained off. And it was a place where you could go with someone of the opposite sex and, um, have your meal and do other things as well. And so Parisians saw it as, a way that they could get some privacy when not at home. Foreigners in Paris did not like it. Like there's a lot of comments about how that they could not observe the other diners when they all go into these little private rooms. And I was just reading them. I was like, I don't know that you want to observe these particular
Not the
diners.
point.
But in America, it became like the opposite, like private rooms in restaurants you could not go to as a couple, right? You had to have a group of 4 or more to be able to use a private dining room. And there's a story of one couple who actually booked a private room at Delmonico's for 4, so the 2 couples, and one of the couples conveniently did not show up. And I have a feeling the way it was written, it sounds like it was planned, but the couple that did show up intending to use the private dining room were not allowed to. They had to go sit in the main dining room. And so these private rooms in America were not, they kind of knew from the French what they were going to be used for. But what was interesting is like these ice cream saloons and luncheonettes, these supposedly like refined refuges for respectable ladies where men were also allowed to go, kind of became places where a courting couple could go, especially, if they were kind of in defiance of the girl's parents, right? Or her family. It was a place where they could both meet at the same time. And so these pastry shops and ice cream saloons and luncheonettes became these places where you have this mixing of genders, which I thought
Ice cream
used
shop
to be
is still
like,
a date place.
yeah.
You didn't seem so sold on that.
Yeah, so that was interesting. This kind of like weird dichotomy of like separating the genders, but also not.
Yeah. The gendering to me was really interesting. So one of my favorite resources when doing a lot of like culinary history is the NYPL menu collection, which was actually curated by a woman. She is wonderfully fascinating. So her name was like an adult, Miss Frank E. Buttle. But she went by Frank. Her name is Frances. And she became the first like menu archivist at the NYPL. Like she kind of like squeezed her way in and found the president of the NYPL at the time and was like, I'm going to give you all of these. And he was like, I guess. So when we're talking about gender division and how women interacted with menus, and you realize she collected, what's the total number in here? 45,000, almost 45,000 menus from across the United States. So she, where's the exact number? It's absolutely like, it's incredible. Let's see. So by 1906, she had started in the early 1900s. She had collected over 14,000 menus. By 1924, when she died of pneumonia at age 80, her collection had grown to an astonishing 25,000 menus. How many restaurants has anybody ever visited on a random day in their lifetime? So the fact that she had collected 25,000 of them, and she was pretty aggressive with them. She would write to institutions. She would write to restaurants all over the world, kind of, and be like, "Can you send me a copy of your menu?" And like Catherine was saying earlier, printing was not cheap. So when you receive this letter as a restaurateur, and you're like, "I'm not sending you a random letter," what she would do is she would actively go to these restaurants, go to them in person to their face and go, I would like a copy of this menu, and would like aggressively wait to get that copy. And she collected them. And it's absolutely like, it's so wonderful because you get such a good sense of the way food changed over time, which I think is a great representation of New York City and I think food culture just in the United States. She had a great collection. She ended up getting a menu from one of the coronation parties for King Edward the Sixth or the Seventh. I forgot my numbers. But that is in her original collection. So the menus that I showed earlier that have those blue stamps on it are from her collection that she got herself. And those were the ones that she collected. She would stamp herself and then put them in the archive. Um, so her full collection is in the New York City Public Library, which is amazing. And they recently, in the last couple of years, started what they called the What's on the Menu project, which is a transcription process. So they've done 9,000 of these menus so far, and they're in the process of digitizing them. And it's an open source concept of archiving, so anybody can go in and write down and insert the metadata of everything that's on the menu, about the menu, the images that are on the menu. So they've scanned a total of about 1 million dishes, a little over 1 million dishes from 17,000 menus so far. I mean, that's just in the last couple of years. But when you think about the things that have been discovered, Scott, who was on one of our past taproom tastings about African American foodways, who's a food historian from NYU, was using it to document Black culture during the Harlem Renaissance in New York City. So he was using these menus as a learning tool. There was one interview that was given. They had believed it was under an understanding that sushi had been first served in New York in the 1960s. And because of this project, because of all of the menus that had been discovered and digitized, they found sushi being offered at a restaurant called Yoshino Ya as early as 1932. So that predates a whole 30 years before what they believed was the earliest serving of sushi. So I think food is this really great idea of where we are as a culture, what's being served, what is a hot commodity, what is really cool. And the menus are these really great pieces of just like physical evidence of that. So please keep menus. They're not collecting any right now, but I have a feeling they will in the eventual near future. But here are a couple of the menus that I pulled. It is an absolutely incredible resource. If you have 20 minutes, just go to the NYPL archives and type in Buttall collection of menus. She has collected the artwork on some of these menus is so truly beautiful. Like the one on the left is adorable. Valentine's Day breakfast, but you can see the detail, the New England Society in the city of New York. That's a completely French menu. That's all in French. This is, and then I do love the one on the right. I love that it is for the Chinese banquet to His Excellency Governor Guild, and Pigs in the Blanket was served in 1907. I top notch. And then they kind of like mix it in with like Chinese meals. So you see a chow mein, Chinese fruits, and then it's like pigs in a blanket with a chop suey. Shark's wings.
I like the pigs in a blanket is served with champagne, Moet and Chandon champagne.
What else would you have it with, Catherine?
I don't know.
But those menus, honestly, like take the 20 minutes, go through them because they recently also took in, there was the chef from the top of the world at the World Trade Center and all of those menus. They took in a bunch of the top chef there after he passed away. His family donated a bunch of those menus as well. I think they're in the process of being scanned. Time capsule. It's fabulous. 10 out of 10. But also, like, we're talking about gender norms and like respectable women. And then you have this woman who's like, no, I'm going to go get all of these menus. And it's thanks to her that we know what was served in half of the restaurants that we're talking about today. So I just, it's Women's History Month. I have to. The thing.
All right, so we've got a few minutes left in the hour. If anyone has any other questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We've talked quite a bit about New York City restaurants, but not so much about Ridgefield restaurants. I mean, we are a little bit smaller, fewer restaurants.
You have the same chutzpah. Don't worry.
So one of the things I did try to find was what was the first restaurant in Ridgefield? Like when did the first Ridgefield restaurant open? And It's very hard, difficult to figure this out, because throughout the 19th century, there were things called restaurants that are probably not considered restaurants, would not satisfy the definition. So it's possible that what used to be called the Elms Inn was the first restaurant. It opened as the Elm Shade Cottages in the 1860s, and it's usually described as like, lodging house, kind of inn, resort, having a restaurant with it. But I could not find an actual description of if it was like a separate restaurant from the lodgings, or if in the 1860s it was more in style American plan, you got room and board, right? Definitely by the 1950s, by the time it was owned by the Scala family, it had a separate restaurant from the hotel portion. But if we say the 1950s for the Elms restaurant, then that's not the earliest I found in Ridgefield. So the earliest I can kind of confidently say is Jean's Grill on Route 7, which was established in 1935. So this restaurant is where the current Barn Door restaurant is, if you are familiar with Ridgefield restaurants. So Jean's was opened around 1935 by Americo Ridolfi. And it was described as fairly close to being an American version of an English pub, run by an Italian man and an Italian chef. But apparently they did not know anybody named Jean. They did not name it after anybody. They just felt that having a woman's name would draw more business. So that's why it was called Jean's Grill. It was then became Cella's in the 50s, when it was run by Edmund Cella. And then in the 60s, Amerigo's son, Louis, took over and he named it Luigi's. So you can see the two photos here. And then Luigi's ran in that spot until around 1990. And then there were a series of restaurants. So that building has actually, since 1935, contained a restaurant. And according to Jack Sanders, is probably one of the only buildings in town that can claim the longest period serving food. So it's like the longest running food service place in town. So I can confidently say the first restaurant that we can confidently agree on is 1935, Jean's Grill. But it's possible there were earlier ones.
Yeah, B said White Horse Tavern is here in Newport, Rhode Island, and dates back to 1673. I love continuous use tavern. I think that's like incredible. But it's also like what you were saying, it sounded like the same family operated it, even though they changed names. Or did it switch families?
It went, so they rented it out, they leased it to somebody else, and then the son kind of took it back and ran a restaurant. And then it kind of kept going from there.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So yeah, so the Barn Door restaurant currently is in that building.
They've got a legacy to uphold.
Yeah. All right, so that is the end of the hour. I hope you learned a little bit something about restaurants, the history of restaurants, and perhaps you may or may not agree with me on what defines a restaurant, because I think just about every place that serves food is called a restaurant nowadays, whether or not they satisfy my criteria. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed learning about the history of restaurants, and I hope you will join us next month, again, second Tuesday, which is April 9th, and we will be talking about gin, which has a fairly long and storied history. So we'll find out all all about gin next month on April 9th. So our website, keelertavernmuseum.org, you can sign up there.